There is something that hurts in a quiet way when someone treats us with disrespect. It is not always a shout. It is not always a direct insult. Sometimes it is a look of contempt, a sharp reply, an ironic remark delivered with a smile, a gesture of impatience, a habit of interrupting us as if our presence were smaller, as if our words mattered less, as if our dignity could be pushed into a corner without consequence. And the most dangerous part is that when this kind of thing happens over and over again, it does not just wound our pride. It begins to distort the way we see ourselves. A lot of people believe respect comes from the outside, that it depends on how others see us, on the approval we receive, on how firm our voice sounds, on the position we hold, on the money we have, on the status we display. But Stoic philosophy teaches something else. It teaches that the center of our life is not in other people's hands. It teaches that peace cannot depend on someone else's mood. And above all, it teaches that no one can truly diminish us without our inner participation. That does not mean accepting humiliation. It does not mean being passive. It does not mean lowering your head in the face of injustice. Stoicism is not the philosophy of someone who erases himself. It is the philosophy of someone who learns not to hand over the command of his soul to every loud, impulsive, or cruel person. Marcus Aurelius, who lived surrounded by conflict, pressure, and power games, reminded himself that the problem was not only what others did, but the space he allowed that behavior to occupy within him. Epictetus was even more direct when he taught that it is not events that disturb us, but the judgments we make about them. And Seneca, with the clarity of someone who observed human nature without illusions, said that the strong man is not the one who is never struck, but the one who does not become a slave to the blow. When someone does not respect you, two battles begin at the same time. The first is visible. It is the concrete situation, the harsh conversation, the provocation, the toxic environment, the attempt to control you, the constant devaluing. The second is invisible. It is the struggle not to become what the situation is trying to pull out of you. Because someone else's disrespect almost always invites us into an error. Either we react with blind anger and lose our dignity, or we shrink inward and begin to accept what should never be accepted. In one case, we become slaves to rage. In the other, slaves to fear. The Stoic looks for a third path. A path of firmness without losing control. A path of dignity without theatrics. A path in which the response does not come from impulse, but from character. Think about how many times someone provoked you, and even hours later the scene was still living inside your head. That person may have already moved on, distracted by other things, while you were still carrying the weight of it, replaying the conversation, imagining better replies, feeling your chest tighten. That shows a hard truth. Disrespect begins in the other person, but it can continue inside us for a long time if we do not know how to interrupt the cycle. And the worst continuation is not the memory. It is the slow transformation of our posture. Little by little, the person begins to walk with hesitation, speak apologetically, say sorry for existing, measure every word out of fear of upsetting someone, tolerate intrusions that should never be tolerated. Without noticing it, that person starts drifting away from his own inner backbone. That is why dealing with people who do not respect you requires more than self-esteem in the shallow sense of the word. It requires inner training. It requires clarity. It requires emotional discipline. It requires the courage not to react the way the world expects, while also not remaining silent the way fear would prefer. Real respect begins when you stop bargaining away your worth in exchange for temporary peace. When you understand that being kind does not mean being available for abuse. When you learn that silence is sometimes strength, but other times it becomes complicity with disorder. And the hard part is knowing the difference. The ancient Stoics spoke often about the nature of things. For them, human beings suffer because they try to control what they cannot control and abandon what is actually within their reach. That idea, simple as it sounds, completely changes the way we face disrespect. You do not control the other person's upbringing. You do not control the other person's maturity. You do not control the other person's envy, insecurity, arrogance, or the need some people have to make others smaller in order to feel bigger themselves. But you do control, little by little, your response. You control how you position yourself. You control what you tolerate. You control the place you allow that person to occupy inside your mind. And many times, that is the difference between someone who wears himself down for years and someone who begins to recover his life. The first way to deal with people who do not respect you is to stop taking every act of disrespect as a definition of your worth. That sounds obvious when said out loud, but in practice almost no one does it. Most people, when treated with rudeness, contempt, or disdain, quickly conclude that there must be something wrong with them. They begin to wonder whether they talked too much, whether they were weak, ridiculous, not good enough. That is the trap. The other person's behavior is immediately turned into a mirror of our identity. And that mirror is false. Epictetus taught that when someone acts foolishly, cruelly, or unjustly, that person is revealing his own distorted view of the world, not the essence of the person receiving the blow. A disrespectful person is not handing you a true diagnosis of who you are. Most of the time, he is simply exposing the size of his own inner disorder. Insecure people disrespect others to feel superior. Immature people disrespect others because they do not know how to deal with frustration. Vain people disrespect others when they realize they cannot control the environment. Bitter people disrespect others because they see in someone else something they themselves abandoned. Not every act of disrespect is about you. And even when it feels personal, it still says far more about the character of the person doing it than about the dignity of the person receiving it. That does not mean romanticizing cruelty. It means not internalizing poison. Imagine someone throwing mud at a clean wall. The wall was hit, without question, but the mud did not come from the wall. The mistake many people make is looking at the stain and concluding that it is the wall's true nature. It is not. The dirt came from outside. In the same way, someone else's disrespect can touch your routine, affect your mood, create discomfort, even produce real consequences. But it does not have to become your identity. The Stoic understands this early. Being struck is not the same as being defined. There are people who spend years trying to prove themselves to those who never intended to respect them. They work harder than they should, speak less than they want to, reshape themselves, correct themselves, make themselves smaller, try to be perfect, polite, impeccable, useful, agreeable. They do everything hoping that at some point they will finally be treated with consideration. But respect that depends on performance is not respect. It is a concession, and a concession changes with the mood. Today it is given, tomorrow it disappears. Today it smiles, tomorrow it despises. Anyone who lives like that is always exhausted, because there is never any solid ground beneath their feet. Stoic wisdom asks for another posture. It asks you to see your worth as something that comes from character, not from validation. You are worth something because of what you cultivate within yourself. Your honesty, your discipline, your ability to act rightly even when it would be easier to surrender to impulse. The coherence between what you think, what you say, and what you do. That worth does not become greater when someone recognizes it, nor smaller when someone ignores it. It exists before applause and survives contempt. The second way to deal with people who do not respect you is not to react in the heat of the first impulse. This changes lives, because a disrespectful person almost always wants to pull out of you exactly what strengthens him, your loss of control. The insult wants an explosion. The provocation wants a scene. The sarcasm wants you to act too fast. When you react immediately, without any inner distance, you hand the other person a kind of temporary power. You let him choose your tone, your rhythm, your energy. And from that moment on, you are no longer acting. You are just responding like a reflex. Marcus Aurelius had a practice that feels deeply current. Before losing himself in emotion, he tried to name the situation clearly. Not the drama of the situation, not the fantasy created by the mind. The situation itself. Someone spoke with arrogance. Someone crossed a line. Someone tried to humiliate. Someone was unjust. That is all. When you can describe the fact without fusing with it, you create a small space between what happened and your reaction. And it is in that space that freedom lives. That space may last only a few seconds, but sometimes a few seconds can save entire days of regret. How many relationships have been destroyed by one thoughtless response? How many opportunities have been burned by a moment of wounded vanity? How many people have said irreversible things because they confused impulse with courage? Stoicism never taught empty coldness. It taught self-command. And self-command is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability not to let feeling rule by itself. When someone speaks to you disrespectfully, breathe before you answer. Not as an empty technique, but as an inner declaration. You are telling yourself, I will not be dragged down to the level of the disorder that reached me. You are refusing to be shaped by the worst moment of the other person. Sometimes the answer will come firm. Sometimes it will be short. Sometimes it will come in silence. Sometimes it will come later. What matters is that it comes from you, not from your wounds screaming in the dark. This is especially difficult when the disrespect comes from someone close. A partner, a family member, a friend, a coworker you deal with every day. The more intimate the relationship, the greater the chance that we will be captured by old reactions, accumulated pain, patterns that keep repeating. In those cases, the Stoic does not say to pretend nothing happened. He says to realize that your pain does not have to become your commander. You can feel intensely and still choose with lucidity. You can be wounded and still position yourself with dignity. You can be disappointed and still not lose your form. And there is an almost invisible strength in the person who does not rush. Most people think power is raising your voice, interrupting, winning through aggression, having the last word. But deep down, that often reveals fragility. The person who truly possesses himself does not need to prove his presence through volume. His firmness appears in precision, in the calm that asks no permission, in the gaze that does not lower itself, but also does not threaten, in the sentence that says exactly what is needed and stops there. This presence, which the Stoics cultivated as an expression of character, has a quiet weight that many people understand only too late. When you stop reacting like an emotional puppet, something shifts. Maybe the other person will keep being disrespectful. Maybe he will even get more irritated because he has lost the spectacle he was hoping for. But you have begun to step out of the wrong game, and that is already the beginning of a much greater freedom. There comes a moment when serenity has to make room for clarity, because the third way to deal with people who do not respect you is to set boundaries without guilt. This point is decisive. Many people manage to stay calm on the outside, but they still allow invasions on the inside. They allow a recurring harsh tone. They allow humiliating jokes disguised as humor. They allow constant devaluation. They allow absurd demands. They allow the other person to push further and further because they are afraid of seeming harsh, afraid of losing the connection, afraid of creating conflict. But a boundary is not aggression. A boundary is dignity expressed through action. Seneca observed that when we do not correct what is out of order early, the error takes root. That is true of the way others treat us. A lack of respect tolerated in the name of peace, once it repeats itself, stops being an exception and becomes a pattern. The other person learns, even unconsciously, that he can push a little further, and then a little further, and then further still, not because he is strong, but because he has met no clear resistance. In that case, the fault is not with the person who was hurt, but responsibility for the next step often becomes his. Setting a boundary means stating, simply and firmly, what you accept and what you do not. No long speech, no exaggerated justification, no need to convince the other person that your pain is legitimate. You do not need to write a thesis to prove that you deserve respect. You simply need to take a stand. It may be a short sentence said at the right time. It may be refusing to continue a conversation in that tone. It may be the decision to leave when the exchange becomes degrading. It may be the choice not to remain close to someone who has made disrespect a habit. A boundary is not theater. It is coherence. And here one of the greatest emotional difficulties of adult life appears. Many people feel guilty when they finally begin to respect themselves. That happens because they were trained to confuse kindness with submission. They were taught, directly or indirectly, that being a good person means enduring a great deal, yielding a great deal, understanding everything, always giving one more chance, carrying the emotional weight of others, avoiding any discomfort. So when they begin to say no, they feel cold, selfish, ungrateful. But they are not. They are simply stopping the abandonment of themselves. Stoicism does not support brutality, but it also does not glorify compliance. Virtue, for the Stoics, is a demanding balance. You should not wound without need, but neither should you offer your dignity as food for someone else's disorder. A well-placed boundary protects both people. It protects you from continuing to be wounded, and it protects the other person from sinking even deeper into his own moral vice. Because every time someone disrespects without consequence, that person moves a little farther away from his own humanity. Think about a workplace where someone always talks over you, cuts off your ideas, acts as if your contribution were disposable. If you just swallow it, the tendency is for that behavior to grow stronger. If you explode, you may lose your ground at the exact moment you need it most. But if, calmly, you interrupt the pattern and say clearly that you would like to finish your thought, something new happens. You did not beg for space. You occupied the space that was already yours. That difference changes everything. The same is true in emotional relationships. There are people who use intimacy as a license for disrespect. They speak harshly because they believe the bond guarantees automatic forgiveness. They dismiss your feelings. They belittle your sensitivity. They turn your attempts at dialogue into something to mock. In those cases, the Stoic is not fooled by the veneer of affection. Love without respect is confusion. Closeness without consideration is the ground of exhaustion. It is not enough to love someone. The relationship must preserve what is most valuable in you, your integrity. And notice something important. A boundary does not work as a threat. It is not something you say to frighten someone. It is something you do to align yourself with yourself. When a boundary depends on the other person's reaction in order to be real, it is still weak. A real boundary is born when you decide that certain forms of treatment will no longer have free access to your energy, your time, your presence. If the other person understands, good. If he does not, reality will teach what the conversation could not. The fourth way to deal with people who do not respect you is to abandon the need to win every battle. This teaching seems simple, but it is liberating. Not every confrontation needs to be prolonged. Not every provocation deserves a full answer. Not every person deserves endless explanations. There are people who do not want to understand. They only want to dominate the space of the conversation. They want to wear you down. They want to drag you onto ground where truth matters less than exhaustion. And in that kind of game, insisting too much is not strength. It is waste. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself like a man trying to remember, every day, that time is too precious to be offered to what makes us smaller. He knew the soul is worn down not only by great tragedies, but also by small useless fights repeated over and over. There are arguments that build nothing. There are debates that do not seek clarity. There are relationships in which every conversation ends in the same maze, because the problem was never a lack of argument. It was a lack of character, maturity, or any real willingness to meet. When you try at all costs to be respected by someone who feeds on conflict, you become trapped. And that is exactly what such a person wants. He wants to occupy your mind. He wants to turn your day into a continuation of his own confusion. He wants you to prove, explain, return, rebut, wear yourself down, justify yourself, beg him to understand what is obvious. But there is a form of power that is born when you realize you do not need to convince someone who is committed to distortion. Sometimes the wisest move is not to tighten the argument. It is to end the access. This requires maturity because the ego likes to win. It likes to have the last word. It likes to display intellectual, moral, or emotional superiority. But Stoicism was not made to feed the ego. It was made to bring order to the soul. And an ordered soul does not enter every available fight. It chooses. It evaluates. It weighs the inner cost. It asks itself, can this conversation produce truth, correction, improvement, justice? Or will it only pull me downward? That question saves energy, preserves lucidity, and keeps life from becoming a string of unnecessary battles. See how this applies in daily life. Someone makes a provocative comment in front of other people, trying to diminish you. Your impulse may be to answer in kind, to prove you can humiliate too, to turn the group to your side. In some environments, that even looks like victory. But the Stoic would ask, and afterward, what remained inside you? Was there dignity, or only vanity fed for a few seconds? In many situations, a short and calm response dismantles more than an emotional spectacle ever could. And in others, ignoring it with quiet poise is even more powerful. That is not cowardice. Cowardice is remaining silent out of fear when your conscience calls you to take a stand. What we are talking about here is something else. It is discernment. It is knowing there is a difference between defending yourself and losing yourself, between correcting an injustice and becoming dependent on conflict, between saying what is necessary and turning your whole life into a permanent courtroom. Some people spend so much time trying to prove their worth to those who do not respect them that they forget to live. The Stoic refuses to fall into that trap. Seneca warned that anger, once installed, quickly stops being an instrument and becomes the mistress of the house. It begins by promising justice, but soon it wants revenge, display, humiliation in return. Then the person no longer wants to solve anything. He wants the other to feel it. He wants to give it back. He wants to mark territory. It is exactly at that point that reason must take the command again. Not everything you are capable of answering is worth the energy it costs. Not every opportunity for confrontation is an opportunity for honor. In many cases, the greatest sign of self-mastery is to step out of the arena, to leave the provocation unfed, to interrupt the cycle, not because you were defeated, but because you refuse to be dragged into a space where no one comes out better. There is a quiet nobility in someone who chooses peace without giving up respect. That peace is not escape. It is a careful selection of what deserves your presence. The fifth way to deal with people who do not respect you is to observe patterns, not isolated episodes. This is vital because the wounded mind sometimes exaggerates one moment, and at other times minimizes entire years. Some people are deeply hurt by a single gesture from someone who was having a terrible day, and others normalize a long chain of disrespect because every now and then the other person shows affection. Stoicism calls us to a more sober vision. Not naive, not paranoid, real. A person can fail once, can speak badly in a moment of tension, can act harshly, regret it, correct it, change posture. That is part of the human condition. The Stoics never idealized human beings as always stable and flawless. We are flawed, contradictory, vulnerable to exhaustion, fear, and pressure. But there is a difference between a failure and a pattern, between a stumble and character, between a recognized mistake and constant disrespect disguised as temperament. When you begin to observe patterns, you stop analyzing the problem only through the emotional impact of the day and begin to see the structure of the relationship. Does this person disrespect you only when he disagrees with you, or anytime he does not get what he wants? Does he sincerely regret it, or does he simply repeat the behavior and later offer empty apologies? Does he respect strangers and only despise you behind closed doors, or does he show arrogance toward everyone? Does he grow when you take a stand, or does he become even more manipulative? These questions matter more than any beautiful speech. Marcus Aurelius said that we should look at things as they are, stripped of the fog that imagination usually places over them. Applied to relationships, this means stopping the habit of judging only by potential and looking at concrete reality. Not what the person promises to be, not what he was at the beginning, not what you hope he will return to being, but what he consistently chooses to be with you. Because it is that consistency, not the occasional beautiful moment, that reveals the truth of the bond. Many people remain in disrespectful relationships because they cling to exceptions. But sometimes he is so affectionate. But she has such a good heart. But deep down I know he loves me. The problem is that the human heart is not measured only by vague intentions. It is measured by repeated actions. The Stoic is suspicious of what cannot sustain itself in practice. Not out of cynicism, but out of respect for reality. A relationship in which disrespect has become routine is not healed by abstract hope. It requires concrete transformation. And when that transformation does not appear, lucidity must speak louder than attachment. Observing patterns also helps reduce guilt. When someone hurts us repeatedly, it is common to fall into the fantasy that if we can just find the right way to explain ourselves, the situation will finally change. But the issue is not always a lack of explanation. Sometimes there is already more than enough evidence. The other person understood perfectly well. He simply did not consider it important enough to change. That recognition hurts, but it frees. Because you stop pouring energy into an endless attempt to educate someone and start making decisions based on truth. In the workplace, this is very clear. A boss who humiliates in public, a coworker who sabotages, leadership that constantly dismisses the same person, a group that uses exclusion as a form of power. If the episode repeats, we are no longer dealing with an accident. We're dealing with a culture, and cultures are not confronted with silent hope. They are confronted with position, strategy, and in some cases, conscious withdrawal. The Stoic does not insist on staying in a place that demands the constant mutilation of his own dignity as the price of remaining there. In family relationships, the issue is even more delicate because blood ties are often used as an argument to justify what should never be tolerated. But biological closeness does not turn disrespect into love. It does not make emotional abuse acceptable. It does not eliminate the need for boundaries. There are parents, siblings, and relatives who have spoken in destructive ways for so long that everyone around them has started calling it just the way they are. The Stoic calls it by its real name. If it destroys, devalues, humiliates, and corrodes, then no label changes what it is. It is still moral disorder. When you learn to see patterns, you begin to respond with more intelligence. You are no longer a hostage to the mood of the moment. You are no longer carried away only by guilt on a bad day or hope on a good one. You look at the whole story, and by looking at the whole story, you understand what must be protected first: your soul, your center, your sanity. The sixth way to deal with people who do not respect you is to strengthen your own life, so you do not depend emotionally on their approval. This point is central because many disrespectful relationships survive through dependence. Emotional dependence, financial dependence, social dependence, psychological dependence. The person knows he is not being treated well, but he feels he cannot lose that bond, that environment, that group, that validation. So he endures too much. He tolerates too much. He shrinks too much. And little by little, the fear of loss becomes greater than self-respect. The Stoics placed deep value on inner self-sufficiency, not in the sense of proud isolation, but in the sense of not placing one's peace in the hands of unstable circumstances. For them, the more you need the world to give you certain guarantees in order to feel whole, the more vulnerable you become. That is true of respect as well. If your sense of worth depends on the approval of people who have no firm character, your life will become an emotional roller coaster. Strengthening your own life means building foundations that do not collapse every time someone behaves badly. It means cultivating inner work, developing competence, seeking practical independence whenever possible, having lucid friends, sustaining a routine that does not revolve around crisis, learning to be at peace without having to win every gaze. The stronger your inner and outer structure becomes, the less willing you will be to accept emotional crumbs disguised as connection. Seneca reminded us that the cruelest poverty is not a lack of possessions, but the inability to suffice to oneself, at least a little. There are people surrounded by others and completely fragile because they depend on someone else's reflection in order to exist. Others, even in the midst of hardship, maintain an admirable calm because they know the center of their life is not in applause, nor in the fear of abandonment. That strength does not appear overnight. It is built in silence, in discipline, in routine, in the courage to face your own solitude without panic. Very often, disrespect continues because the other person perceives, even without saying it, that you are afraid to lose. Afraid to lose the relationship, afraid to lose the job, afraid to lose the group's acceptance, afraid to lose the image of being a good person. And anyone who notices that fear may, consciously or not, use it as a tool. That is why part of the Stoic path is reducing the power certain losses have over you. When you discover that you can survive more than you imagined, the world changes. The tone changes. The posture changes. Your presence changes. This does not mean impulsively cutting everything off. It does not mean abandoning responsibilities. It means preparing yourself. Sometimes a person needs to strengthen his professional competence before leaving a toxic environment. Needs to reorganize finances before breaking a destructive dependence. Needs to build a support network before stepping away from a relationship that consumes him. Stoicism does not teach bravado. It teaches strategy with courage. It teaches acting according to reality without inwardly bowing down to it. There is also a more intimate side to all this. Strengthening your own life means returning to inhabit yourself. Many people who live with chronic disrespect begin to live turned outward. They are always trying to predict the other person's mood, avoid explosions, interpret silences, measure words, reduce their own presence so they do not provoke another attack. It is a life on alert, and over time, the person loses touch with what he feels, what he wants, what he thinks. Recovering from that is a profoundly Stoic act. It is a return to inner government. Start noticing what begins to bloom in you away from disrespectful environments. Does your voice become lighter? Does your body relax? Does your thinking become clearer? Does your creativity return? Does your mood improve? Do you laugh more easily? These changes reveal something important. Maybe you are not difficult, weak, or too sensitive. Maybe you are simply tired of surviving in places that wound your dignity. Realizing that is often the beginning of a reconstruction. And there is a beautiful consequence when a person strengthens his own life. He stops asking for respect with his eyes, stops begging for recognition through behavior, stops bargaining with his value. His presence begins to communicate, quietly, that certain kinds of access are no longer available. Not out of arrogance, but out of hard-won peace. There is a kind of calm that frightens those who only knew how to relate through dominance. And that calm is born precisely when you no longer need so badly to be chosen by those who do not know how to choose with nobility. The seventh way to deal with people who do not respect you is to be willing to walk away when staying destroys who you are. This may be the hardest point of all, because it touches attachment, fear, and hope. As long as we still believe the other person may change at any moment, we endure a little more. As long as we remember the good moments, we endure a little more. As long as we think about the time invested, we endure a little more. As long as we imagine what other people will think, we endure a little more. And in that little more, we sometimes lose years. The Stoics knew life is too brief to be given away without discernment. They also knew that companionship shapes character. Little by little, you begin to resemble what you tolerate every day. The environment enters you. The tone enters you. The chaos enters you. And if staying in a certain bond requires you to betray yourself again and again, then that staying is charging too high a price. Not every distance is abandonment. Sometimes distance is medicine. Epictetus said that if you lie down beside someone covered in soot, you will inevitably come away stained. That image applies to companions, relationships, and environments. Not because we should think of ourselves as pure and others as impure, but because prolonged closeness to moral disorder has a real effect on the soul. You may enter a place as a calm person, and after enough time there, become reactive. You may enter with confidence and leave apologizing for everything. You may enter with a sense of worth and leave begging for emotional scraps. That is why walking away, in some cases, is not an overreaction. It is preservation. Of course, not every form of distance needs to be dramatic. Sometimes it is physical, sometimes emotional. Sometimes it means reducing access. Stopping the endless explaining. No longer chasing. Ending certain forms of intimacy. Speaking only when necessary. Leaving the environment as soon as possible. Not offering someone the same depth of presence he uses to wound you. Wisdom lies in understanding that closeness is a privilege, not an automatic obligation. Many people fear that walking away is a sign of weakness, as if the strong person were the one who can endure everything. But that is a distorted image of strength. The strong person, for the Stoics, is the one who lives according to reason and virtue. And living according to virtue includes not remaining, out of vanity, fear, or neediness, in situations that degrade one's own soul. Staying where respect has died is not moral endurance. Very often it is simply difficulty accepting the truth. There is an unavoidable pain in recognizing that some people will not love us in the right way, will not respect us in the necessary way, will not treat us in the just way. That pain is real, and Stoicism does not tell us to pretend it is not there. It teaches us to endure it without turning sadness into servitude. You can grieve what the relationship could have been and still refuse what it has in fact become. You can miss someone and still know that your peace must come first. You can leave with a heavy heart and still leave with your head held high. In modern life, this applies in a profound way. There are people trapped in cycles of disrespect within romantic relationships because they confuse intensity with love. Others accept abusive bosses because they confuse opportunity with submission. Others endure cruel social groups because they confuse belonging with humiliating approval. In all these cases, Stoic philosophy asks the same quiet question: what in you is being sacrificed in order to keep this arrangement alive? If the answer is your peace, your dignity, your lucidity, and your integrity, then the cost has already become too high. And notice how these 7 ways are not just separate techniques. Deep down, they form an entire posture toward life. First, you stop confusing someone else's disrespect with your worth. Then you learn not to react like a slave to impulse. Next, you set clear boundaries. You choose not to waste your soul on useless battles. You observe patterns instead of deceiving yourself with isolated episodes. You strengthen your own inner and outer structure. And finally, you accept walking away when staying becomes destruction. This does not happen all at once. It is training, a gradual return to your own inner sovereignty. Perhaps the deepest lesson of Stoicism on this subject is this: the respect you seek begins in the way you govern yourself. The world will not always be just. There will be rude people, manipulative people, envious people, vain people, aggressive people, people incapable of recognizing another person's worth. That is not going to change completely. What can change is your participation in that theater. You can stop being a stage for the confusion of those who have not yet learned how to live with nobility. You can stop offering your mind as a home for offense. You can stop abandoning yourself in order to be accepted. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the best response to those who act without virtue is not to imitate their lack of virtue. That is one of the most powerful lines we can carry into life. Because disrespect, when it reaches us, tries to transform us. It wants to leave us bitter, reactive, defensive, insecure, or cruel in return. It wants to convince us that the only way to survive is to harden in the worst way. But the Stoic chooses another path. He hardens character, not the heart. He strengthens lucidity, not arrogance. He protects dignity, not ego. So the next time someone tries to diminish you, remember something essential. A person's worth is not found in the way he is treated by those who live in disorder. A person's worth appears in the way he responds without betraying his own essence. It may be through silence. It may be through firmness. It may be through distance. It may be through a boundary. But always with the awareness that your soul is not for sale. In the end, this is the true freedom taught by the Stoics. Not the freedom to control other people's behavior, but the freedom not to let that behavior govern your center. And when you reach that, something very deep happens. Disrespect may still knock on your door, but it no longer finds an unprotected house. It finds presence. It finds character. It finds a person who finally understood that peace without dignity is only another form of prison. And perhaps this is the sentence that deserves to keep echoing after everything grows quiet. The one who learns to respect himself in silence no longer begs for consideration from those who live in noise. And before you go, subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this, more Stoic wisdom, more clarity, and more strength for everyday life. And leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these ideas travel, and it means a lot to know which part of the world you're listening from.